So with that, our first panel of the day is going to take a little bit of a deeper look into brackish groundwater and where we are. You heard a bit yesterday from the legislative debrief panel as well as from Chairman Larson about the importance of developing brackish groundwater as one of the possible ways to meet the growing water demands of Texas. And so that is what we're going to look at a little bit more this morning. Moderating this panel, Zach Holland with the Bluebonnet Groundwater Conservation District. I'm going to let him introduce our exceptional panel members. So let's welcome them.
Awesome. Again, really greatly appreciate y'all being here and continuing to kind of take a deeper look into brackish and the furthering discussion that we've had and continued to build over several years. Brackish groundwater is certainly a continual focus and kind of the next great kind of new water source that has kind of been identified and for a lot of different entities, whether it's oil and gas or public water supply, to target that source in developing and broadening the different water portfolios. And the general objective here is, again, to continue that focus in the development of brackish groundwater and kind of see where we've been, the things that, over time that we've addressed and taken into account, and also some things that may still be yet to, some challenges yet to be solved that we're going to discuss about, and general updates. Again, this panel really does not need any introduction specifically. Everybody knows these names that has talked or worked with or read or done any research whatsoever about brackish groundwater and the development from either the technical side or certainly the legal side or the agency side. So with that, we'll kind of get into the general background and update from the Water Development Board on brackish efforts, and we'll turn the presentation part and kind of the general outline of that to John to provide that presentation with some study of the zones and the designations, the legislation and kind of the accomplishments to date, and kind of a general update on kind of where in the world we sit with brackish groundwater. John?
Well, thank you very much. Pleased to be here today. The board has been working for the last 10 years on doing some very detailed mapping on brackish groundwater. We're really kind of building upon a lot of the work that both federal and state and a lot of consulting agencies across the state have been working on for the last several decades. So it's a fantastic opportunity for us to really take a look at this particular resource in a tremendous amount of detail. One of the things that we do, in our studies is to really evaluate the entire resource of the aquifer, not just the brackish water. So we'll map from outcrop all the way down to down dip, with a lot of focus on brackish water, which is about 1,000 to about 10,000 milligrams per liter TDS. And then, of course, in some areas, we'll map all the way up to 35,000 milligrams per liter TDS, so it's approximately equivalent to seawater type work. When House Bill 30 was signed and passed several sessions ago, that added a new dimension to the type of the work that we have to do by developing brackish groundwater production zones, within this brackish groundwater resource. And then there were a lot of stipulations within that legislation on what we can and we cannot do when we designate those zones. So we worked on several different studies across the state. CREZO, we've worked on some of the Cretaceous aquifers most recently, the Blossom, the Nakatosh, and the Northern Trinity. So we've designated zones in those areas. Our website has got a tremendous amount of information, so if you're interested in the exact studies where the zones have been designated and all the research that has gone into it, and really all the raw data and the GIS files that we've prepared for these studies, all of that information is available on our website, and it's all for free. And certainly if you've got any questions, certainly go ahead and get a hold of us. So, we're always there to try to help you all out. With respect to some of the new initiatives that is kind of going on, one of the things that was put in the House Bill 30 legislation was that we couldn't designate brackish groundwater production zones in areas where there's been designated or used for injection activities with the 6 classes of injection wells. And so that is been very problematic for us. We're going to be initiating a study this next fiscal year to try to find a better, more science-based application what kind of distance around these injection wells should we term basically off limits as a buffer so we don't designate zones in those areas. We know where a lot of the wells are, but we don't really know where all that injectate fluid has gone. So that's kind of the purpose of that study, so we'll be working on that. And then we'll try to reduce the size of our current buffer zone, which is extraordinarily conservative, to more of a science-based. The next big news, of course, is the passage of House Bill 722 this last session, where districts that have brackish groundwater production zones will probably need to put groundwater rules in place for that development, should they get a petition or should they desire to. And then it puts the Water Development Board in a very, very interesting perspective, something that we haven't really done before, and that is reviewing the permit applications and then also taking a look at should the district worry about significant impact to, say, a freshwater resource. They can turn all of the information that's going to be required of the applicant, the monthly and then the annual reports, over to the board, and then we would have to make a determination of what that impact might be. That's putting us in kind of a new role. It's probably putting some of the districts in a new role as well. And so the main point I want to kind of get across is communication is going to be paramount between the districts and our agency to try to set a really, really good stage, the type of information that we need to see, and have a good comfort level between all of us so that we can kind of work through this new process. So certainly if you're a district that has a knowledge of plans of brackish development in your area, please go ahead and get in touch with us. Now, we like to have as much lead time, and I'm sure you would too, as to those new types of plans. And then certainly if you are considering developing brackish rules, I would encourage you to kind of get moving on that early. I know some of you already have, and that's really good news, because with the legislation, with the 180-day time clock, should you get a petition, that's not a lot of time. It seems like a big number until the clock starts on that. So it may take time to kind of get those rules in place. So certainly work with us on that, and we want to work with you on that. I guess I'll turn it over to Zach for kind of the rest of this segment.
Thank you, sir. There I am. Also touch base, kind of just from the general background components, Neil, Steve, do y'all have anything to kind of add to that greater kind of just general perspective of the background of brackish development, kind of getting up to where we are today?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. Good to be here and talk with you this morning. I had a couple thoughts. I think I left one of them at the Lukenbach Pavilion last night, so I'll give you one. And since this is a general brackish groundwater panel, there has been a trend. A lot of this discussion will be on municipal uses. I think that's where a lot of the demand is. But there have been, a lot of trends, particularly in the Permian Basin and maybe other places around the state, to use brackish water resources for industry or oil and gas, as opposed to using the generally better quality and shallower resources. And a lot of that's happened voluntarily by the oil and gas industry with some, public pressure on that. And there are some entities, such as university lands, that actually requires their leaseholders to use water from the next aquifer down below the shallowest, best quality aquifers, and that's generally the Dockham, and that's generally a brackish resource, but it's not so salty that it can't be used by oil and gas. It's usually pretty good quality for them.
Thank you, Neil. So the technical issues, I think from a groundwater district perspective, I've been in the water field in Texas now for, I guess, 42 or 43 years, and seen over time the need to, increase our portfolio and get things going differently. The way the state water plan exists today, there's just a tiny, tiny little pie slice for brackish development. And in fact, from the 2012 water plan to the 2017 plan, this tiny pie piece even shrank a bit more. So when you kind of go back down and break down what are the reasons for this, lack of enthusiasm, whenever we actually have been a leader as a state in brackish water, production, and we've got many, many examples. It's not like we're pathfinders anymore. It's not like new things. but it's new to the folks that have not yet done it. It's new to them, and it's a little bit intimidating perhaps. So as I've talked to folks, and actually involved in projects, I was involved, with SAWS, for example. I was the regulatory consultant on getting the Brackish project up, and so those things are good examples. They're pathfinders for all of the rest of us, and they build through those things, and I'm sure we're going to talk about some of those in a little while. So the things that go on in a Brackish project that could lead people to have some concerns have to do with probably, and John, the Water Development Board, for example, is doing studies on Brackish development. We don't know in detail, let's say, until you drill that hole, exactly how that's going to go, because it's the earth is an uncertain, uneven thing out there. As we find out when we drill groundwater, you can have 400 feet of Carrizo sand, and you get out there and you think you're going to have a 1,000-gallon-a-minute well, and it's a silted Carrizo section, and you only can get like 50 gallons a minute. Like, well, go figure. So that's what it's like, and we've got this so you're going to have to spend some money on an unknown type of well, explorational process to figure out your well field on the front end, and that's a little scary to do that. And the more the board over time gets more definition, and they will, I think, with the combinations of the oil field data and other data, well logs, and all their acquisition of data, it will reduce this uncertainty that these municipalities have about what's going to happen when I drill this hole, and it's going to be an expensive hole, and what am I going to get, and over time, what am I going to get, that quality-wise? So, because you design your treatment around that projected quality, not where it is today, but what do you think it's going to be in 5 years? And there have been examples in Florida and other places where the quality migrated wildly, essentially, and that said, a tremor across the whole municipal world, like, oh wow, we don't want to have that happen. Well, it's unusual, it's rare. So other technical issues have to do little things, little minuscule things that are important. In some projects, they have filter pack issues where one well's got a correct filter pack and they're not having any fines and all that problems that are coming towards a treatment plant, and other ones didn't. And it obviously was just a small difference in what crew did that day, how they did that filter pack and how it was overseen, and how did it, all those little things that go into life. It's like the little things do matter, and if you don't get the filter pack right on any well, you got some problems, but especially because in desal, pre-treatment is king. Pre-treatment determines how your success will be. If you're doing your pre-treatment correctly, the membrane technologies are stable, robust things, and they're not going to be a problem. It's going to be your pre-treatment that gets you in trouble if you have those things come through and damage your RO track, for example. Over time, the membranes have gotten better and better, and the energy it takes to run any of these high-pressure systems has really gone down. There's energy recovery systems, and the geometries of these membranes has improved incrementally practically every 6 months. There's little version improvements, so it's always getting better. And there's either other enhancements out there in that front. For example, one of the things is instead of RO membranes, they're going to nanotechnology membranes, which the nanomembranes are a little bit bigger, pore size, and if you're mainly in groundwater, unlike seawater, you're mainly dealing with divalent ions. They have more calcium, magnesium types of things, sulfates, and those divalents are captured pretty effectively by these easier to flow membranes. So that's just a couple of other examples. And the biggest thing I guess I need to leave you with on what's the technical issue, number one would be, and I should have started with number one, what do you think? I mean, that's...
We back up into the good stuff.
Yeah, okay. So number one, or the one you should leave with, is residuals. Getting rid of the residuals on a technical level is one of the huge impediments and had to be solved for the SAWS project, and luckily we had a really fantastic solution there locally, but it's not always the case. And so where are you going to get rid of those residuals? And we've accomplished a lot in that front where the legislature has given us help in many cases helping resolve how can we dispose of those things. I will get into those issues when we get to the regulatory side of the track.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. And you've kind of provided a really great kind of tie-in to some of the technical challenges and those pieces there. And since Mike came all the way over to here, especially from a SAWS perspective, and especially your extensive background in working with, the regulatory as well as the policy challenges, you have a couple thoughts on just the general background and kind of what the progression of how we've gotten to where we are today?
Well, I would just comment, my arena is more specifically, well, first of all, glad to be here. Thank you very much for having me. Is more in the regulatory arena, but just to kind of follow on the conversation first, if I may, on the technical challenges, because I did talk to our folks that work with that more on a day-to-day basis to kind of try to find out what it is that we are experiencing now that our project is off the ground. And on the technical front, and I think I would follow on the comments made about the information, needing more information, that you are going out there and you have modeling and you have what information you have, but you're not really going to know until you start to produce. And that's really where it's so important. And so I think for us, we, just by way of background, for those of you that don't know, we have our H2 Oaks desalination facility in Southern Bexar County. We started operating in November of 2016. This project was over 10 years worth of planning and work at a cost of approximately $200 million. It's designed to be modular, so we are involved right now and can be expanded. It's in the first phase right now. And that phase was designed to produce 12 million gallons a day, or 13,440 acre feet a year was what we projected. But the thing is, that type of project had not been done in the Wilcox. There was really, in a traditional project, you may even have irrigation or ranching numbers or what, but that Brackish is not being used for that purpose, so there really wasn't much to go on. So we spent considerable time looking into the data that we could find, oil field information to determine the geologic structure, the salinity, data from private log libraries and the Railroad Commission. We had studies, the board, that showed there was extensive brackish there. And the GAMs, but the GAMs, though, are broader in base, and you're not looking at the very site-specific area that you're going to be working on. So we did test wells, pilot treatment testing confirmed that RO was going to be suitable. So we got going, but going from modeling to actual production data has resulted in some need for project modification. So I guess as you look at lessons learned, you do the best you can to model, but you get the project going, and then you may have to make some changes. And for us, the plant, the disposal, the control systems worked well, but the well field production was not as originally expected. And this is because the water levels in the lower Wilcox sands are more, the sands are more resistant to passing water flow to the pump than we initially predicted. So again, not the technical person, but I'm told the transmissivity was not as we expected it to be. Also we had, and I think Steve mentioned this concept of production wells producing some sand and silt also. So we've been able to update our model and the expected yields using the actual production data that came in. So for example, we've had to drop pump levels. We've added sand and silt filtration systems. We've drilled a new production well, and we converted one test well to also be a production well. So we also ended up on the chemical makeup. I think you mentioned chemical makeup is not, you don't know till you're producing. We've ended up having to do some cleaning of the third stage of the RO sooner than we expected. So I guess the lesson learned is that real-world production data and information regarding the exact chemical makeup are so important. And once you get that going, you can make the adjustments you need. And I think as we see projects get off the ground, we'll have more certainty because we see what happens when you actually move forward. And so that's kind of our perspective on the technical.
Absolutely, and that's a great transition of kind of rephrasing and kind of tying this back on the general technical challenges of the technical side is all about these projects being on the ground and getting off the ground and filling in those data gaps that are truly unknowns. And from a general modeling perspective, again, just the technical knowledge, you don't know anything for certain until you physically get those wells in the ground and physically start gathering real world data. And so on that, we can start with you and kind of go back down. But where is more science and data needed to help these projects define themselves, kind of moving forward, and then what do we still not know about the potential effect of brackish groundwater development on not only freshwater aquifers, but certainly subsidence and some of those other greater impacts that are certainly concerning in the groundwater world?
Sure. I'll go ahead and give a crack at the first part. I think in every phase, from initial characterization back to development, we need more and more science. Typically, when we go ahead and do a study, we rely on geophysical well logs, both from water wells and oil and gas wells, to try to characterize these different aquifer units based on the resistivity signature and sometimes the SP signature of those sands. And when you put those values into these formulas, there are still a lot of unknowns. And we don't have a lot of water quality data from the higher salinity aquifers to use to try to calibrate these logs. And so you're trying to do the best you can based on these estimates. And so one of the things that we're looking forward to is trying to work with and maybe get some more expertise either through training or working with some of the universities and some petrophysics experts to try to see how can we kind of tease some more of this information out. And then certainly trying to get information like we've gotten from SAWS to say, well, we've got water quality data and we've got pumping tests and we've got really good quality logs. How do we calibrate those logs as we try to move deeper and deeper into the subsurface? So that's a huge, huge thing for us. And especially when we get down to right around 10,000 TDS. That's the point where EPA is kind of considering it underground source of drinking water, and that's the threshold for injection. And so trying to pin that down is a huge challenge. I think the next big challenge too, and it's been alluded to by our panelists, is that the board does regional models. Contractors do regional models. Sometimes contractors do site-specific wellfield type models, but it's all desktop at that point. You might, if you're really, really lucky, and I encourage the districts out here too, when you're considering brackish rules, work with your applicant and get some test wells and some monitor wells in there first before that permit is kind of developed. Because if you don't have those site-specific numbers, you might be really, really surprised. And maybe not the district perhaps, but certainly the applicant's going to get surprised. And then it may take years, literally, of pumping and looking at the results and looking at all this information to find out really how is that aquifer going to react, both from a water quality perspective and then the water quantity perspective, and also the well drilling and materials types of techniques. We've got some really, really fantastic companies within the state and in adjacent states that really know how to put in a good water well. But when you start getting into brackish zones, all bets are off with respect to how corrosive those waters are going to be, how it's going to affect the piping and the pumping and the silting, because it's not like you can run fresh water into a ground storage tank and have a sand trap and maybe you get a little sediment in your tank. That stuff is going straight to the RO plant, and then big problems can happen. So Steve's points on pretreatment is king. I think some folks have probably underestimated that from their initial well field design and testing to you really have to dial that in. And if you look at a permit that says we don't need pretreatment, that should be a kind of a great big red flag. So those are some of the things that I can think of from a technical standpoint. And then certainly there's some additional regulatory challenges out there. The board and a lot of other folks have worked very well to try to make some changes at the state and federal level, especially like with the Class 1 general permit for treatment plant disposal wastes. That is absolutely fantastic. It's one permit across the state. Anybody can apply for it, and there's no public hearing. So, hope is smiling, because there was no public hearing on that. And there shouldn't be, really. It's the same kind of design standard for the well as a regular Class 1 well, but you don't, get into emotions and things like that, when you get to that part. But more work can be done. And so certainly, as we all kind of communicate with one another, hopefully, as we move forward in brackish development and production, we can identify some issues. And if the board can help with respect to maybe doing studies, both on science and technology and facilitating regulatory changes, we want that, because we want that little slice of pie that Steve mentioned to become bigger and bigger. Back in 2011, we had a pretty significant response to people looking at brackish groundwater development when reservoirs were drying up and wells were head was dropping quite a bit. And then it started raining. And I'm sure that even though the slice of pie looks kind of thinner from now until 2070, the next drought that's just around the corner is going to gain a lot more interest. But as Hope kind of mentioned, it takes a decade or more and many millions of dollars to kind of get one of these plants up off the ground and running.
Thanks, John. On the technical side, it's been mentioned, but this issue of understanding the water quality is huge. And I think most of us in this room understand if you put in a well field, if you think of this room as an aquifer, top, bottom, sides of a well field, you understand pumping, drawdown, you don't want your wells too close because of interference and things like that. And then with the brackish aquifer well field, you have the additional component of water quality on top of that. And so if you really want to understand what's going to happen, you have to be able to know or reasonably predict the water quality in all dimensions, so front and back, left and right, or right and left for you, and up and down. And you can have very large variations in water quality in all of those directions. And you're also concerned about what's going on the floor above, the floor below, and over in the next conference room, because over a long period of time, that's the water that's going to be drawn into your well field. And one of those directions is likely to be down dip, for example, with higher concentrations. So one example of the way that this might work is the Colorado River Municipal Water District and their Ward County well fields. I mean, they have a brackish aquifer well field, and if you think of wells within this room being the well field, they have some shallow wells that might come a third of the way down from the ceiling that have good water quality. There's parts in there that are 1,000 milligrams per liter or less, so fresh water. They have other wells that may come 2/3 of the way down, and at the very bottom you can reach all the way to concentrations of 3,500, 3,600, maybe even pushing 4,000, 5,000 at the bottom. And so each of those wells has different water quality when you pump it and a different production capacity. So you need to understand when you have this well on at 1,000 gallons a minute and it's bringing out a certain salinity, and it's mixed with this well at 500 gallons a minute and it's bringing out a different salinity. How does all that mix together to provide to the customer the water quality that they need? And they're a raw water supplier. So it gets very complicated. It's hard to get that information, especially with depth and off to the sides. And we don't have it because people haven't been drilling water wells into salty aquifers. If you're on the Ogallala or somewhere like Jason Coleman, you're not so worried about that because you're going to draw in water from the sides to your property, but for the most part, the quality of that water is probably going to be very similar to the water that's under your property already. But all bets are off in a brackish aquifer well field regarding that issue, and it's very expensive to collect the data. It can be well over $1 million to put in a deep monitor well off to the side that you're not even going to pump, which is what a hydrologist would like to have, but you start adding those up to put together this three-dimensional picture of water quality, and it's extremely expensive.
Absolutely, and appreciate that, and kind of to tie back in, and we'll start with Hope kind of transitioning into the general regulatory challenges, and kind of get some follow-up from kind of the technical side that they've seen on the regulatory side. But Hope, would you mind kind of speaking to some of the regulatory challenges y'all have encountered in the general development and whatnot like that?
Sure. So from the municipal perspective, on any project development, as much certainty as we can have is critical. If we're talking about fresh, we're talking about brackish. And really, and one thing I've worked on in legislative sessions for a number of sessions on a lot of different fronts is where can we find some balance between the certainty that you need to get these projects off the ground with the need of the district to be able to manage the resource. And it's those spots that we're really looking for in regulatory efforts. So in the case of Brackish, like we've talked about, these are very expensive propositions, a lot of planning, a lot of money, and the idea is to encourage, especially larger utilities, urban areas, to look at these more expensive projects where they have ratepayer bases to absorb some of those costs and really get those off the ground. So for us, when we began planning our project in 2006, we looked at a lot of different configurations of the projects that would potentially take us within the jurisdiction of a groundwater district. But working through the issues, there were a number of questions. There was some discomfort about, do we have enough data? Do we have enough science to move forward? What are the appropriate monitoring for this project? Really, how to come to agreement regarding what the parameters for the development should be. And so ultimately, we came to the decision to do the project within Bexar County and work on proving up the science, proving up the viability of the project. So while we're not currently within the jurisdiction of a groundwater district, when we expand, if we expand this project, we will be within. And so we want to continue to work on ways to encourage districts to adopt rules that favor brackish development, provide as much certainty as possible when you're looking at such an uncertain an expensive proposition to start with. Efforts like House Bill 722, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit, are certainly in that vein. So I think that's really the critical balance we need to have.
So I think that we might be sending a mixed message today, and that's probably needed because it's brackish is a wide-ranging field in Texas. We've got look at our aquifer maps for major and minor aquifers. So there you go. We've got a lot of different diversity. So many of the communities that need to, in my opinion, that need to develop brackish because it's like under their feet versus these expensive, they're going to importing fresh water, groundwater, or surface water from long distances, they're piping it or whatever they're doing otherwise. I know towards the coast, there's some of these operations. They could be more inexpensively treating brackish under their feet. And so while it is true when you're putting in a major project with lots of capital and it's going to be a huge well field and lots of pumping that you're going to have to try to figure it out from some test wells and things like that, there's enough science and desktop material and other drilling that has occurred and geophysical logging that you can go ahead and do these smaller scale projects. And because, for example, pretreatment is something that modularly you can come in and enhance very simply on that, say, hey, we didn't get this right on the front end. We're going to go ahead and add this extra piece. We have a little extra iron and manganese that we didn't realize, whatever that is. You can do that on the front end. You can change it. It isn't like, oh, no, we're sunk. So I don't want to send that message because it is such a robust technology. It is so advanced today. It's so incrementally getting better that TCQ, I was part of the group, the board did a project that was looking at how do we do away with this extensive pilot testing on this so-called innovative technology of RO for brackish. Well, and so we put together how other states do things and how other countries do things, a report, and then TCQ took that and changed their rules. And they allowed brackish development without a pilot testing thing because you can model the chemistries and you can then go backwards and do your RO adjustments, the pretreatment adjustments. So, I want to, if we're trying to get some relief on our freshwater sources, then we can't, get too intimidated by tackling the brackish. It is doable, and the good thing is because we have some large-scale projects in Texas, we're able to go back, and I think this would be a good example, good case for the board, John, is to go back at all of these well fields that are doing brackish development in Texas, and there's a lot of chemistries, minute chemistries, looking at over time, like things like the boron and barium and other things have become scale on membranes that sometimes is irreversible scaling. We can do some analysis and create better understanding so that those people that come along in the surrounding communities regionally, well, they already have this much more robust data set, and they don't have to replicate that. It's just like, and SAWS is doing an example of that right now. They're producing good data that further Wilcox developers will be able to use to go forward much more definitively. So I think we're very blessed in Texas to have this really good stock of, larger utilities are all over the state doing brackish use, and that if we get a little bit more microscopic about what's happening there chemically in their water and over time especially, I don't think they collected all their water and set it aside, maybe over time, that would have been great. So have a specimen of the water from 2011 or something like that, that'd be great. So that's going to help you do that. And so these projects are doable. They're done all the time. The things that some people talk about is the corrosivity of the water. There's usually higher chlorides or other salts, or there might be sulfide more in those deeper formations. And you'd say, wow, I wish we had some casing and some screen material that doesn't corrode. It's like, wow, they invented that 35 years ago. And so in Florida, for example, they use fiberglass casing and fiberglass well screens even, and those same casings and same screens are still there today, and yet we're over here in Texas still replacing, and the board itself even paid for a study that proved up that this was a great idea, but it's not disseminated itself into the industry. As an example of how little things keep people have their mental block on, oh, I'm gonna have to be replacing the casing and the screens constantly. So, well, no, not really. We've solved that one. So we'll get into more regulatory issues, I think, in a minute.
Neil, do you have a thought or two on that before we step into the House Bill 722?
Not other than, yeah, it's always a cost issue. I mean, what option is least expensive? We did have a project in Arizona. It was a very small community. They didn't have a lot of money to fund investigation. They drilled a brackish well. They had about 3,500 TDS, deep aquifer, 3,000 feet. And that's what the TDS started at, but they didn't have money to do monitor wells and things like that. And once they continued to use the well over time, the water quality, it deteriorated to about 5,000 TDS. And there's technical solutions to all these things if you can fund it. But if you can't fund it, then that's a problem. They ended up actually mothballing their plant and not pursuing that and pursuing some other options. But so it gets back to how much you can actually do these investigations, and then if you run into a problem, can you pay for the solution?
Awesome. And again, I know that John kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but how's 722 kind of coming out of, and the discussions that went into developing 722 change the regulatory landscape and its anticipated effect in the development of groundwater brackish?
Definitely. And just quickly before we go to that, just to follow up on what Steve said about, I do agree that I think that, brackish can be utilized for a lot of different purposes. And I think that it gives a good opportunity. The more that you have projects like ours that are getting off the ground, you have that data that others can use. And you can really also, another thing is to start looking at partnerships with folks that need water in areas where you're developing projects. And I think that opens another opportunity for that in the state. So you heard some brief discussion of House Bill 722 and yesterday's legislative debrief, I know, but I think a pretty kind of one-sentence takeaway on the regulatory landscape is the bill basically provides certain parameters in law for permitting certain types of projects within brackish groundwater production zones. And these parameters are basically designed to incentivize that project development. As many of you know, there probably is a number of you who are involved in the process. The passage of 722 was really the result of several different sessions worth of work, Zach well knows, between all the stakeholders. You had municipal interests, you had folks that work on the technical side, consultants, agriculture groups, landowner groups, the groundwater districts, all involved in trying to come up with a process. Again, within this bill is limited to the brackish zones that are developed by the board, but coming up with a way to provide some things that can incentivize the project, but recognize at the same time the district's continued regulation of the resource. So I think, and also take pressure off of fresh water. And this is one of the ultimate goals here. So I think Greg mentioned yesterday, these elements include specifically withdrawals that are consistent with what the Water Development Board has determined is available through the zone process, a long-term permit term, a 30-year permit term, and reasonable monitoring requirements. Those are kind of the three elements I think that were most critical. And as we talked about before, those are developed with a technical review by the Water Development Board on the compatibility of the proposed well field with the zone itself and recommendations for the required monitoring system. And so while these particular items are designed really through that process to give more certainty to the permit applicant, the bill specifically ensures that the continuing authority of the districts to review and amend permits should there be declines in water levels that were not anticipated or changes in water quality that were not anticipated. And there's a process for having the board do a review that we talked about earlier on what those changes are that a district can then use to decide if there's a need to make a change to the permit. And really, I think, like when there was testimony during the session, we talked about how this bill has components that can benefit all the parties. You know, you've got districts that are benefiting from the expertise of the board in determining what is the amount of water that's available and helping with determining what is the appropriate level of monitoring. You know, the public benefits from the information that is required to be provided by the project developer every year on quantity and quality of the water, and any board report on potential negative effects. So we have a mechanism to see what is happening as this project progresses. And then the permittees are benefiting because they're getting a longer-term permit, more predictable production, more predictable monitoring process. So this kind of dovetails with the previous conversation about a lack of production information. Really, the heart of the discussions on 722 was once we've identified these areas that really have the potential for developing brackish, what can we do to get these projects off the ground, get kind of get us off of center and get us moving, and address some of sort of what have been the sticking points, what is the correct monitoring, what happens when there's a negative effect you weren't expecting, and pulling the board in to help be sort of a third party to help, the permittee and the district to move forward.
Absolutely. That's a kind of a great kind of transition, kind of in the general kind of wrapping up this general discussion that's taken into account kind of where we've been, where we are now, and kind of where we're ultimately moving forward. So turned over to John kind of to wrap up that 722 and kind of give a brief, kind of snapshot of the implementation of the mandate from 722 and kind of where the board's kind of pushing and going in their direction from the guidance from the legislature and moving forward. And then we'll go down for Neil and Steve to get some final thoughts from them as well.
Terrific. Hope did an incredible summary, so I'm going to have to probably give her my bottle of wine as a speaker afterwards, so I don't have to kind of remember all of that. Yeah, yeah. I guess just for certain people, blue shirts or something. From our perspective, as I said earlier, it puts the board in an interesting position because we're not a regulatory agency, but we're kind of in this impartial third-party position, which I think the legislature wanted, and perhaps I think a lot of the GCDs wanted too, especially with respect to, if they had to hire firms to act as a third party, that might be very expensive as well. I think from our perspective, we got funding to hire one person, so we started interviewing this week for that person because we need somebody that's going to be doing modeling with the perspective of a well field size study and also understanding how the characterization must go so we can kind of figure out are the monitor wells that are reasonable, and that's a balancing act as well, are being proposed for a particular study. The feedback mechanism, I think, is absolutely crucial. If we had done a characterization study, and I know SAWS relied on a characterization study by your consultant, they did not predict how the well production would change. And so that feedback mechanism, I think, is absolutely critical. Plus, it's going to put all that information into the public sector because we'll be getting copies of those annual reports based on monthly data. Currently, we're working with our general counsel to kind of figure out, do we need to designate rules, or do we have authority, or do we even want to rules? But we certainly want this dialogue with the districts because even though the bill specified the types of information that have to be put into a permit, I kind of made a list in the office and said, wow, we really need a lot more. And if I talk to someone like Neil from a design standard, he would say, well, we need a lot more monitor wells and a lot more science, and that's true. So there's a balance there. So I certainly think that we at the board want to work with the districts that have got brackish development in a zone on the horizon to talk with us, because, for instance, one thing, if you develop a typical freshwater well, you don't really care really what's below you. But from this perspective, you really need to drill some of those test wells maybe 100 or 200 feet deeper and test those zones and look where the layers of clay are that may be isolating, say, a brackish portion from a much higher salinity portion. That's going to be absolutely crucial, so you don't talk to your engineers later down the road and say, guess what? You know, we're not getting the production because our RO membranes are treating higher salinity water. So I think that dialogue and trying to figure out what is the minimum amount of information that a permit applicant should be providing is essential. The other thing that the bill didn't say that I alluded to earlier was the ability for, say, a district to permit a test well and then maybe a test monitor well before the permit is even sent to the district and then eventually to us. Because if you don't have that site-specific information, it's a real big desktop study. And those can go in different directions. And so you have to have that stuff. We can only do from a regional perspective based on the information that we have available to us, many of that data is decades old, you know, really, really old geophysical logs and things like that. So I think that dialogue is pretty essential for us to kind of move forward. And we want to make sure that we develop this resource. It's essential. When I first started my career, San Antonio was a single source aquifer and renowned for, yeah, we only have the Edwards, that's all we need. And now this agency has one of the most diversified water portfolios in the country, and you need to. You need to have that, and you need to be thinking out decades in advance. I think a lot of other water systems have to have that because droughts are not necessarily the abnormal event in Texas. They're part of the recurring system. And so water systems have to plan for having that diversified portfolio if your primary source is impacted for a short or maybe a longer time period. So I think brackish desal is a great resource. It's going to be more expensive and more risky, but we have to keep moving forward, and we are.
A couple of quick kind of sum up, you know, kind of your one sentence takeaways, especially from a technical perspective for you and Steve.
Well, I think one, you know, for the districts, I mean, to the extent you can, pay attention to water quality as well as water quantity and water levels if you think these, you know, types of projects may be in your future. And there's a number of districts, you know, Fayette County, for example, and Pecan Valley, who've done pretty comprehensive water quality surveys. And that's always a good thing to know because it's just like the water levels. If you don't know where you've been, you don't know if it's changed or by how much it's changed. So you might give some thought to also collecting data on water quality if you can.
Well, I'll close with this that's not necessarily technical. It's kind of a lived experience. And I had to ask myself, you know, recently getting ready for this panel, we had our discussions on the phone, and I had to step back and ask myself one day, I sat down on the back porch, why is it that I have been so interested in developing brackish and marine and other type of projects for the last several years? Why am I interested in that? Like, there's other things that I could be doing. And I realized the precipitating event in my life was at TCQ, which at that time was TNRCC, and after the 95, 96 drought. And during that cycle, you know, I was representing the ED and John Hoffman was representing the commissioners. So we had a two-man triage team. And we went out to these communities during that drought, which was a pretty bad drought. And we had to work on getting people emergency water setups. We had to do some crazy things, like get abandoned oil lines from Chevron to run some water from, I think it was Navarro Mills Lake, to plunge and run it to a creek that filled up the city of Wortham's lake, where they were 2 weeks from out of water. And I had to go to those city hall meetings, and the town was in panic. mode. And it was just like this visceral fear that forever changed those communities. There was at least a half a dozen that were, days and weeks away before we got different kinds of triage things. I won't go into all those different ones, but it emotionally changed who I am, because I realized how it changes the economic and the psychological character of a community to lose their water source. So I guess that's what it comes down to, is this idea of I'm extremely pro aquifer recharge, aquifer storage recoveries, and brackish desal, drought-proof supplies, marine desal, drought-proof supplies, because I have seen what happens personally, and what those communities, I saw the fear in their eyes, and I experienced it, and it was horrifying. So, we have to do something. We cannot, I think, looks to me like we're 7 weeks into the next drought of record right now, so that there will not be enough time for you to wait for some others. These projects can take 5 and 10 years to get up off the ground sometimes, smaller ones faster, but you can't wait till the drought and you're in the middle of it, because it's going to be too late. And the evaporative rate of these lakes that we depend on so much, and then it puts huge pressure on the aquifers when that happens. So the lakes disappear on us. Look what happened in 2011. The lakes just disappear on us. You had full lake and it's gone. And so all the conserving in the world won't save that. And so we got to have drought-proof supplies.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you. Want to thank the panel, and we have some quick time for questions, and most importantly, I get to turn it back over to Leah to ask the questions, because I am way out of my league on this panel. Or if there's one from the audience. Ms. Saws.
Hi, Zach. Thank you for your presentation. This is directed to John. The zone under the bill, zone production is in addition to the amount of modeled available groundwater developed in the GMA joint planning process. And it's my understanding that those models calculated the MAG, not considering the quality of the water, the salinity of the water. And I was wondering if you could comment on the possibility of double counting water availability in those areas or those regions where there is a zone.
That's a good one. I figured somebody would probably bring that up, and I'm glad Larry French, right over here, is there, who kind of manages the groundwater group. There is that potential, probably, because the majority of the brackish plants, to my knowledge, in the state are probably producing in the 1,000 to 3,000 range, maybe a little bit higher in West Texas. And the mapped extent of the majority of the major and minor aquifers across the state goes from about 0 to about 3,000 milligrams per liter TDS. And there's a few exceptions like the Edwards and the Dockham and so on. And so when we do our brackish mapping, we take a look at the 0 to 1,000, which is fresh, and then 1 to 3,000, which is slightly saline. 3,000 to 10,000 is moderately saline, and then very saline is above that, and then brine and so on. And so the way we kind of categorize the brackish aquifers that way allows us to get at least an initial estimate. Are we dealing within the 1,000 to 3,000, which may be also part of a regional model and the modeled available groundwater number. If we're expanding the physical extent of an aquifer, say down dip, and we're getting into past the mapped extent and getting down into deeper saline zones, then we'd probably have a pretty good idea that that water has probably not been counted into the model number. From a procedural standpoint, I'm not sure how that's going to work out. I really don't. And I think we need to have some discussions both internally and so on with that, because we've got legislation in place, but then we've got other procedures in place on doing the model available groundwater, and then we have these characterization studies. So I think that's a risk, certainly, to potentially double count, and I think we'll kind of have to look at it from a zone-by-zone basis to kind of figure out, is that a potential?
And is that something that the water board will be involved in
Yeah, we're going to be having some discussions on that. I mean, literally, I don't think the ink was dry on the bill when the governor signed it, when management, who is also here in the room, had said, hey, implementation, let's get going, what's the plan? And that's going to take a little bit of time for us, to kind of work through those questions and things. But I'm glad you asked it, and when I saw your face in the back of the room, I knew I'd probably be hearing from you today. And if you've got other questions, anybody in the audience, because there's not enough time on the panel to bring these things up, certainly let us know, and then we'll do our best, both from a technical standpoint and a regulatory standpoint and a procedural standpoint. And we don't have all the answers, but we'll have to figure them out.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, Mary.
And we got a couple questions via technology. I don't know if we'll have time for all of them, but one was to ask the panelists their perspective on whether there needs to be additional financial incentives for Texas to develop brackish groundwater.
So there was a bill this last session, I think it might have been 2545, Guillen's bill, that came pretty close to passing, but I suspect Senator Perry's going to have a group working pretty quickly, I think in November perhaps, that's going to be looking at to get ready for the next session on how to incentivize both brackish and marine and things like that, and produce water. Produce water, we're sticking 1 million acre feet a year into the subterranean funeral home there, so it's got to, if we could harvest some of that produced water and get that salvaged too, that would be good. So I think I mean, in my opinion, we absolutely need to incentivize to get some things over the hump, I guess you could say, in certain cases.
I would agree. I think that's a topic that the legislature is interested in, is how can we incentivize these types of innovative projects and supply development. I believe the legislative panel spoke about the need for supply development yesterday, and I think that will be on their minds.
I think we can take this last question as well. I hate to not get to all of them. Do you think that we will see the boundaries of brackish groundwater production zones change in the future as we get more data?
Oh yeah, there's absolutely, positively, no doubt in my mind that will happen. When we were faced with House Bill 30 and having to have 4 aquifers basically evaluated within a year, and our contractors, some of them are in the room, from the time we got the contract ready, basically from January to August 31st, had less than a year to evaluate that study, and then we had a very short period of time to kind of like come to the board and get that ready by December 1st and have a report back to the legislature. Less than a year. I mean, I can't believe that we all kind of survived that. So thanks to everybody that kind of contributed to that, certainly. There was a little bit of a ringer, in that bill with respect to injection zones that I kind of mentioned before. And the typical thing is that you can't have injection of, say, Class 2 produced water in waters less than 10,000 TDS. We started to see that might not be exactly what's going on in certain places, and I think a lot of that is due to how do you estimate where that 10,000 line is off a geophysical log over decades and decades and decades of different people doing permitting across the state. So we've got a kind of a coordinating committee with the Railroad Commission, and we meet almost monthly talking about issues like this. That's where we really need a science-based study to figure out what those buffers are, because we not only have to take a look at where is the injection well, where is it injecting, where is that inject date gone to since the injection began, where is that inject date going to go in the next 50 years, because we have to look 30 to 50 years out into the future. That is going to be interesting. It's going to be a lot less than the 15-mile buffer that we put in place. I'm almost certain of that, except for karst. Karst, forget about that. So we're going to be able to reduce those zones, and once we get that more information, we're going to go back and we're going to revisit that a lot, and it's going to take some time. When we met with Larson after the first round, we told him there's no way we can identify every little zone within this time frame, especially if you've got like a one-well field. I mean, your brackish zone could be, maybe a half a mile or something like that. We can't identify every little half-mile, spot within a state this big. So we know we're going to go back and do that, that's going to take some time. But we want certainly some feedback as well. And we've talked to some folks, Mary and some of the districts who have zones already designated. I think once we get into going from desktop to actually production to figure out what size and effect these things are, that'll kind of change the way too.
All right. I think it's time for us to give a round of applause to this great panel. Thank you.